Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the API Security Evolution, Trends, Threats, and Solutions. My name is Eric Swenson, Head of Product Marketing at Traceable, and I'll be your host for today's session. As organizations embrace APIs to drive innovation, many remain at various stages of maturity in securing these critical assets. Today's discussion will cover key topics surrounding the state of API security. To lead this discussion, we are thrilled to have two outstanding experts with us. Sandy Carielli, Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Sandy advises security and risk professionals on application and product security, with the focus on integrating security throughout the product lifecycle and safeguarding modern application architectures. Richard Bird, Chief Security Officer at Traceable. Richard is a globally recognized expert in cybersecurity, data privacy, and API security. He is renowned for translating complex security concepts into actionable business strategies. Sandy and Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
Absolutely.
Before we dive in, sorry.
Let's do that again.
Yeah,
close out. Your piece was great. Sandy, go first.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
Yeah, awesome to be here as well, Eric. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Before we dive in, just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and the replay. Let's do that again. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and the replay link will be shared with all registrants. At the end of the session, we'll also have a live Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions via chat at any time. With that, let's get started. I'll hand over, pause, redo. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and the replay link will be shared with all registrants. At the end of the session, we'll have a live Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions via the chat at any time. With that, let's get started. I'll hand it over to Sandy and Richard to kick this off by really setting the stage of where we are when it comes to API security maturity. Go ahead, take it away, Richard and Sandy.
Sandy, I'll let you go first. I'm super excited to have an opportunity to be on a webinar with you because you sit in a role where you get to see everything going on within the industry as well as advise organizations on what steps to take. So I'm super interested in your perspective.
Yeah, and really happy to be here and discuss this with you, Richard. You know, I've been covering API security and application security at Forrester for 5 years now. And it's really been interesting to see the evolution of how organizations look at and approach API security. When I first started looking at it, I would say, it was very early stage. Organizations didn't really know what they needed to have in place for API security. They were just considering it. And then there started to be more evolution about concerns about discovery, concerns about understanding what was even in their inventory. And over the last couple of years, that's really evolved. There's still an awareness that, yes, we need to understand what we have. We need to collaborate better with our development team. We need to have some coordinated governance. But now we're also seeing a lot more in terms of API security testing that honestly wasn't thought about much or asked about much a few years ago. And I suspect that some of that was that there was this assumption that existing testing tools would do the work. And over time, they realized they needed a little bit more, and they needed to be a little bit more specific to test for API-specific security issues that maybe weren't common, weren't something that you would find in traditional AppSec testing. So that was a really interesting lesson learned in evolution. And now it's starting to become more about how do we take all of these disparate requirements, disparate tools, and put it together into some semblance of an API security program. One of the really interesting things that we find every year is we ask about adoption of various AppSec tools in our annual survey. And you wouldn't be surprised to know that, say, web application firewalls have always had a very high rate of adoption. But API security isn't far behind. And what's interesting about that is how we ask the question and what I think is behind that answer. Because we ask, are you adopting API security? And a lot of people say yes. But what does that actually mean, right? Does that mean we're using some API security rules in a web application firewall? Does that mean we have an API gateway? Does that mean we are doing some API security testing? Does that mean we have deployed a full-fledged API security platform? it could be any of those. And I think that speaks to the fact that API security is still such a disparate, confusing term for a lot of organizations. They haven't wrapped their arms around what does a full API security program look like, which if you think about it, maybe shouldn't be that surprising, because how long did it take us to understand what a full application security program would look like? It's it's very similar. It's the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, there's a lot of points that I definitely agree with you on in terms of your observations. Not that I disagree with any of the points, but my perspective kind of comes from two different angles. The last 2.5 years, every day, 24/7, for me
Yeah.
has been in API security. And I like to think that I'm one of the few, maybe you can count on one hand, people in the world that has literally traveled around the world to hundreds of companies, had thousands of conversations about API security program, API security, what does it mean, and kind of collected, been an archaeologist and anthropologist of API security use cases. But I also come at the conversation from 25 years of having been an IT and security practitioner in the corporate world. And what I find really interesting since I started was that APIs were really coming online as I was finishing up my enterprise executive roles. When we saw, kind of mass retail adoption of APIs around 2014-ish into 2018-ish. And then we saw really a massive acceleration of the use of APIs coming through the COVID era, where
Yeah.
remote programming and remote work meant there were a lot less folks that had direct access to systems, and they needed to capitalize on the strength and the power of APIs to drive business value. But what I think has gotten lost in a lot of this is that there's been a decade of wild abandon in the creation and distribution of APIs, which creates a problem on the AppSec side. The most common question I hear is great, you can help me in terms of AppSec on the DevOps side, but what about the 10,000 APIs I already have in production? And that raises the question, what does API
Yeah.
security look like if you're only focused on AppSec? And the other thing is that there's a lot of folks, whether it's just the generational changes of new workers coming into technology and security, or collective amnesia for those of us that have been around a long time, is that there are patterns that are recognizable here. So we think back to the
Yeah.
days of data classification, right? When data classification first happened, I remember, gnashing of teeth and, hand waving of there's no possible way we can ever classify all of our data, or we could never figure out where all of our data is at, or we could never. So observability and transparency of the assets itself is something that we've seen before, but what really has changed is virtualization. Has been the continuous atomization of the tech stack. And because APIs now represent this very small fractional component that's associated with a much larger transaction flow or a microservices implementation, we've distanced the developer from the actual outcome. People don't know what they're actually, what
Hmm.
the final product is going to be that they're building, because they code their API and that API is connected or joined to this endpoint. And because of this atomization and virtualization, what's really happened, and I see this continuously, even with a 2-year now wake-up call on the importance of API security within the enterprise, which I have seen that happen. What I haven't seen happen is an understanding that your API attack surface, and this ties, I hope, neatly and directly to your observation, the attack surface that is APIs is everywhere. It is across
Yeah.
every componentry of your technology stack. It is your transportation layer. It is your ETL layer. It is everything that our data centers and our monolithic applications used to be in one tiny little snippet of code. And because of that, I see a lot of people in denial about going and actively hunting to understand how large or how pervasive that attack surface is, through simple tasks such as cataloging and discovery and risk assessment, because there is a certain resistance where if I actually know how big the problem is, I've got to do something about it. Um, and
Yeah.
and and having been an old CISO, I understand that, there are constrained budgets and constrained resources, and that is a legitimate issue, but being a legitimate issue doesn't rationalize the risk away. So we're
Yeah.
living in a very risky era relative to APIs, as far as I've seen.
You know what I love about that, Richard? Your point about just the attack surface of APIs and how APIs are often chained, what you're really leading into is the extent to which APIs are part of the broader software supply chain problem. And
Absolutely.
one of the interesting things we found over the past couple of years when organizations say they've been breached due to an external attack, and we ask this question, how was the external attack carried out? Now, overall, application-related vulnerabilities, application-related attacks are very high up on that list, whether it's your traditional web application attacks, software vulnerabilities, or software supply chain issues. But software supply chain has been number one for the past couple of years. And it's a combination, I think, of the breadth of the attack surface, along with the awareness that, oh, yeah, this is actually a problem. And what's interesting about that as well is that, yes, you have your sort of internal facing or your external facing attack surface, but then you also have all of your third-party API calls to all of these other resources. And nowadays you've got LLMs as well, and you don't necessarily have the controls and the checks. And that's a software supply chain issue also that maybe we're not paying close enough attention to yet. So all of these things just stacked on top of each other means that, yeah, it's not easy.
Well, we've seen the manifestation of this in actual breaches and exploits. And let me caveat that first, because I always like to say, like, if you ever meet a CISO that says that's interesting, what they really mean is I'm terrified, because the reality is that even today, with the rise in API attacks and the way that they've been publicized and read out in the news. We know that the large percentage of breaches are still facilitated through foundational security flaws, right? Access control, authorization, authentication. And actually, what's really interesting is all of those same foundational issues apply in the API space. And when we see them being abused, we see them being abused post-authentication. We see them being abused at the authorization layer. And this is where it gets really interesting from a supply chain standpoint. So if we think about that reality of atomization, there's another reality that virtualization has created in technology, which is democratization, right? I don't even have to be a great programmer anymore, right? I don't have to be code knowledgeable. I don't have to, and I'm not saying that as a ding, right? Because I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea of the art of code, right? And it being
Yeah.
something mystical like Hogwarts, right? I believe that technology is a faster tractor. But when you combine this atomization and democratization, what you end up with is an exponential growth and interconnectedness within the ecosystem. So when we look at it from the supply chain standpoint, we tend to still consider partners inside of our supply chain to be trusted.
Yes.
And in our case, we have found actual abuse and exploit attacks that have been dozens of endpoints and dozens of companies away from you, because your partner has partners and your partner has partners and partners, and that really exponentially growing spider web of connectedness is all tied together at the API layer. And that's where we're seeing these abuses happen.
2 points I want to hit on there. One, in terms of just the partners of partners of partners, it's really interesting. If you look at the top breaches last year, based on number of accounts that were compromised, I think 3 of the top 35 were due to MOVEit. So,
Yep.
I mean, in terms of partners of partners of partners, that's a prime example there. But the other thing I really want to come back to, and I'd be interested in your take on this, in terms of that, not everybody is going to be a coding deep expert, and citizen development has become a lot more common. But one of the things that's really interesting is that even with professional developers, if you look at folks that say went to school and studied computer science, studied development. A couple of years ago, we looked at the top, I want to say 50 computer science programs in the US and the top 5 or something internationally. Only a couple of them had a secure coding class. And even in those cases, it wasn't necessarily required. So you're not learning secure development in school. You learn it when you get out. But then if you're a citizen developer and your job is to build business applications, your job is to apply the business logic, where are you learning it? And if you're not, and you really shouldn't necessarily be forced to spend a ton of time on this, who is implementing the guardrails to make sure that you can build the business application without, well, making a mess?
Yeah, and I had no intention when we started this, conversation to egregiously name drop, but I can't help but avoid to do it. My dear friend Helen Patton,
Hmm.
who's written Careers in Cybersecurity, was 8, 9 years as a CISO at Ohio State University. This has been a big campaign stump for Helen and a number of other people in the practicing cybersecurity community, which has been, even with the rise of great college programs. I think about Pitt, I think about University of Miami, Ohio, that really kind of pioneered the beginnings of formalized cybersecurity education at the baccalaureate and the postgraduate level. Um, Her position is that even those organizations are not operating from a syllabus of currency, right?
Right.
Current in the moment challenges, and it raises a lot of questions about if bad actors live in an opportunistic economy of learning, right, where they are just simply finding new ways and faster ways to attack organizations. And our education systems do not have the same level of flexibility or opportunistic viewpoint, right? Like
Yeah.
let your folks go out and learn how to be white hats and go how to break things and those types of things. Are we putting ourselves at a disadvantage? I think the logical answer to that is absolutely. But then when we look at APIs, I think, and it correlated. You just can't avoid the conversation around AI. When you look at those two particular components, you see a lot of unsupervised, um, uh, you know, activity. And I'll kind of wrap it up with one of the most fascinating experiences I ever had was sitting with a red team a couple of years ago, and a group of API developers. And an API developer was
Mm,
sitting right next to a red team member, and I remember the developer jumping up out of his chair and looking at the screen and going, "But you're not supposed to do that with that. That's not what that was made for." And of course, the pen tester is laughing, right? And he said, "Well, yeah, I understand that, but I can abuse your API to make it do things that you never intended it to do. And by the way, it looks like normal traffic." Because those indicators of compromise are not as easy to discern in an API as they are in monolithic code, right? And so it's very interesting times for sure. But I think you've tapped on a really important edge of the conversation, which is, are we actually prioritizing our efforts to train and teach people on the most immediate concerns that are happening in the environment?
yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, there's the education element of this, and I don't necessarily know that we're teaching this at the undergraduate level, and I don't know that we'd necessarily even be able to keep up with the stream of new developments to maintain something at that academic level. But I do think it's interesting when you start to look at that collaboration between security and development and who's owning API security and who's owning API management and who has the knowledge there, and whether there's training or awareness going on, who's in charge of governance, are these two sides talking? It's another, I mean, it's DevSecOps all over again to some extent, but because we just
Yeah.
keep learning the same lessons over and over again. But I do think there is an opportunity for the same type of education and collaboration we've done with traditional development to do that with APIs.
Well, I think you've hit on a really important topic, which is the ownership
Mm,
and frankly, chain of custody. Not to sound like an old risk guy and legal guy, but the whole life cycle of APIs and the whole ownership of APIs, and this gets into one of those repeated patterns that we should have understood from history um, is an extremely problematic area in the enterprise world right now. I can walk into any large Fortune 500 company and say, who's in charge of APIs? And it's like, who's on first, right? And they go, well, he's in charge of APIs for development, and he's in charge of APIs for AppSec, and CIO is in charge of APIs for data transport, and you go, well, okay, so are you coding to any defined standards? No, we're using SOAP, REST, Graph, and
right.
okay, are you reusing API code? Have you instantiated any kind of discipline or standardization around so that you're not having people go out and grab API lines from repositories and sources that might cause you a problem? Nope, we don't do that either. And it's like, and one of the things I remember the early days of IT service management. And I think most of us spent 200 dog years of our life trying to identify the owner of assets within an organization. Who owns this server? Who owns this box? Who owns this? And I remember a lot of the arguments from a budgetary standpoint in the enterprise at that time were like, okay, just stop doing this because it's taking too much time and it's costing too much money. And can anybody just stand up and say that they own it? And here we are again with APIs, and we have exactly the same set of problems. And I think that it may be even worse because I find frequently that people do not realize that if you go back to the 2011, 2012 timeframe and the white paper that came out that really kind of established the API economy, if you go back to that paper and then you kind of reel forward, the original stated purpose, frankly, this goes back to a research paper done in 1955 by IBM researchers. The original stated purpose of an API was a software component to allow the connection of one application to another. There's 2,700 different definitions for an API now, right?
Yeah,
It isn't,
yeah.
yeah, it isn't something that's isolated to a single function anymore. So everybody within an organization, it's the six blind men and the elephant parable. Everybody in the organization only recognizes or acknowledges APIs that reflect their particular interests, right? This is an API for a front end. This is an API for an onboarding workflow. And when you ask them to think about other APIs that they're exposed to, there's blank stares. Like, I don't know. It was like, well, hey, is your entire stack that you're running that front end on microservices? Because those are all APIs, right? Are all your AI calls for request and response, those all write on APIs, right? And so there definitely is a massive gap internally within organizations because there hasn't been an effort to actually understand the diversity of the API ecosystem that you've built for yourself. That goes beyond the attack surface, right? Like
Yeah.
I get really interesting conversations with cloud migration, cloud service providers, and they go, "We have all these APIs that move cloud loads, and we can't tell whether or not they're efficient or not." And you're like,
Oh,
wow,
yeah.
like there's not just security issues with APIs, there are operational efficiency and cost issues that really haven't become a part of the conversation within enterprises yet today. And I'll kind of you put a bow on that by saying one of my favorite questions to ask in any company that I walk into is, have you ever told your CFO that you have 17 different groups that are developing APIs? And without a doubt, they have redeveloped the same API for the same function a dozen times because your CFO loves redundancy, right? They love you spending money to do the same job 7 different times, and they won't have any problems with that, right? And obviously, folks go, well, I haven't thought about it that way. And I'm like, yes, you haven't thought about it that way because you really don't have your arms around what your API universe looks like. Once you start to look at it and say, well, 30% of my APIs are redundant, that's dumb. I probably should go fix that. That's not a security problem, although a propagation of APIs without any controls can become a security
It
problem
could
from a
be,
sprawl,
yeah.
right? So yeah, I mean, it's like I said, I love the era that we're in. I just wish I saw a faster closing of the cognitive dissonance gap between security professionals, and API enablers within an organization, so that they really understand the risks and the threats that they're exposed to.
So can I inject a little bit of positivity and
Oh,
hopefulness
sure.
into this? What I will say is that one question we've been asking this year is around where are you planning to increase your AppSec investment the most? And among security decision makers, the top answer, or the most commonly selected answer, was API security. So I do take that to mean that there is awareness and understanding that this is something we have to pay more attention to.
Yeah.
I think that's good. The other thing that I think is a positive is a lot of the work and research that I've been seeing around that, the role of the dev team, the role of the API enablement groups, and how security needs to fit into that. One of my most interesting customer conversations, I think it was earlier this year or late last year, was a security team that got on the phone with me and asked, hey, do we have to work with dev on this, or can we just set policy ourselves? And I can understand where that question came from when you're used to a very sort of dictatorial approach, which, from a DevSecOps standpoint, I don't recommend anyway, but I know that there's a lot of history around that. But that realization that if you think about the range of API security processes and tools and products and API management tooling out there, the reality that dev is probably already doing some of this. And going back to what you said about not wanting to tell your CFO that you're reinventing the wheel 8 times, this is the other part of it. It's entirely possible dev already has some governance in place. It's entirely possible dev has already created a taxonomy that security can leverage. So this is where, I am hopeful because I think we are starting to give organizations the awareness that they need to look outside and really collaborate with the dev team to create something broader and more unified in the environment. That's my injection of optimism, Richard.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of cause for optimism, especially around the recognition of the scale of the problem and recognition of the the way that APIs are being abused. Now, the news cycle is helping with that, but the way that APIs are being
Yes.
abused. I think you bring up a really interesting point there because, like, if the first half of my IT career, I was on a tech ops track that led me to be a CIO. And the second half is information security that led to cybersecurity, because we have to call it cybersecurity now because it's cool. And
Fair.
and in doing that, I always like to say the reason I felt like I was a good security executive and CISO is because I'm a former unreformed reprobate on the CIO side, right? I remember telling my security professionals back in the day, no, I'm sorry, you didn't fund this code release. I don't care that there's, critical vulnerabilities in it. We will fix it on the next release because my business wants this app now, right? And those used to be really, substantive conversations, right? Those conversations don't even happen anymore because, again, you're not talking about, monolithic application code. You're talking about a piece, a snippet, a single transaction flow. And I do think, for a long time, I was really, really frustrated with the dev side of the equation when I was in security. And then one day I woke up and I realized, like, I'm an idiot. Yeah, a technologist, a developer's job is to achieve business value through a technological solution. A security person's job is to protect the assets, the resources, and the reputation of a company. They're not diametrically opposed, right? But when we look at the API security space, there is a tremendous gap in knowledge on the security side of that equation.
Yeah.
DevOps knows how to build APIs, right? To your point,
Yeah.
some of that has led to them building their own homegrown, or group or department focused governance and approval and all the type of management pieces that you have there, and you have security professionals that are showing up who are applying kind of the same AppSec frameworks around APIs where APIs are, again, much more atomized. You're not going through toll gating. You're not going through, all of these different stages. And I see a lot of security organizations trying to overlay that heavy weight of security oversight onto APIs as if they are these, big, code programs, right? And I think that's led to a tremendous amount of tension between those organizations. I mean, one of the biggest things I hear from CISOs is the big fight that I have with my other IT colleagues all the time is it's time to remediate.
Mm.
And an API gets called out, and we got stuff that needs to get done, and we're taking weeks to get a response back on what we need to do to fix it. And I think that raises a very important possibility of, is API security a space where we need to have technologies that are not just discovering vulnerabilities, but are able to provide guidance back to the DevOps community on how to remediate that vulnerability. And that's a level of evolution in tools and capabilities that, maybe things like AI can help contribute to it and everything, but there's a level of evolution that we haven't necessarily seen in prior technology waves, right?
It is
And
more
that's,
challenging, yeah,
yeah,
because so much of, to your point earlier, so many of the API vulnerabilities are, to your point, beyond the authentication piece. It's more business logic. Explaining how to remediate those it's not as cut and dry as fix this SQL statement.
yes. Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
So it almost has to be two parts. And again, some of this feels very familiar to me from an AppSec perspective. There's the guidance on remediation, and then there should also be the guidance on mitigation. What do you
Yes.
do until you can remediate it? How do you minimize it? How do you protect it? How do you control it? So both have to be important, and there needs to be that balance. And then, to your point, security's got to be comfortable signing off with the mitigation until the remediation comes into
Yeah. And,
play.
and, and, and that mitigation piece, I think there's a really challenging technological shift going on. So I work on an operating thesis that um, security architectures change every decade. And I always like to use the example, 2014, you're a CISO. I was a CISO. You have an opportunity to renew Symantec AVG or buy a 3-year-old company named CrowdStrike that's talking about something like endpoint DLP. And I always ask that question in large settings and say, what choice do you make? And all the young folks, I know I make myself sound old, but all the young folks go, I'm buying CrowdStrike. And I'm like,
Ah,
no, you're a CISO. Yeah, you're a CISO. And you've had a 14-year long contract with Symantec. Like, revisit that. And they go, well, I'm probably renewing ABG. And I'm like, yeah.
yeah.
And in 2017, clearly the wrong decision. In 2020, Symantec no longer exists as a standalone company. And now we talk about MDR, XDR, all of the DRs as if it's always been a part of our vernacular, and it hasn't, right? It's been a decade that we really have come into focus on that. I believe that we're in the same window with APIs because when we look at the way that we have managed, and this goes back to the very beginning of this conversation, when you said like, what does API security mean when we're asking these questions of these enterprise organizations? And it ties directly into the challenges with mitigation. The vast majority of technology over the last 7 or 8 years that focuses on API, focuses from a security standpoint, focuses on it from a traffic management standpoint, and
Yeah.
focuses on it from a coarse-grained IP blocking method, right?
Mhm.
You can make an argument that you can do nuances with, rules and policies, but I think history has shown us that rule and policy management is pretty horrible and extremely costly. And so now it raises the question about if there's so much rich information within an API relative to context, but the best mitigation that I can get if I've got a vulnerable API is to block that API. Are we in one of these transition periods where we're looking
Mm.
at fine-grained security control starting to come into focus? Now, I'm the first to admit, like fine-grained security control has been a utopian state that anybody that's been in security has been hoping and wishing for years and years and years, right? Because it allows us to address threats in a way that doesn't interrupt the business, which is always, job number one, right? But we haven't had the compute power, we haven't had the technology, we haven't had the languages that have allowed us to be successful with the fine grained layer. And I say that having been an old ABAC committee member, um, a long time ago. And I do think that we're coming into that time frame, and AI may be again an enabler for this, for us to be able to munge so much interesting threat analytic data at the fine-grained control layer. But it raises the question about what will be the function of those coarse grain providers at the edge or the boundary, and will they change and become more fine-grained controlled, or will fine-grained control be a componentry unto itself? And I think those are a lot of unanswered questions in the market right now.
That's interesting. I mean, when I listen to that, my first thought is I hope it doesn't become another offering in and of itself, because the last thing we need is to make this even more and more and more of a patchwork. I need to see it come together into something unified, because I think the market needs that. We don't need 10 different API security pieces in your pipeline and in your production environment. But I do acknowledge that we haven't solved this and that it's hard.
Yeah, yeah. And the question becomes is are there enough nuances or subtleties between all of the different ways that APIs are used, right? Obviously the answer is an API security platform, which is a little self-serving given the sign behind my head here, right? But this has been my experience. There are substantial differences in API behaviors and API deployment methods and API authentication and encryption protocols, all the different kind of componentry. There's a lot of diversity, right?
Yeah.
So, if we look at the boundary and the edge side of this equation, it raises the question of, okay, great. Well, now we're going to control at the edge and the fine-grained control side, but now what do I do about the AppSec side? What do I do about the runtime protect post or outside of my boundaries, which is another frontier that we see a lot. We've actually seen exploits where, and I think this is I'd love your thoughts on this. I always say APIs are not covered by the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, right? And when we look at CFAA, we have this really interesting problem, which is, okay, if I've done everything from a responsibility and accountability standpoint as one person or one company on this side of the endpoint to secure that API, and that API is released in transit to the wilderness and makes it to the other endpoint, and that other endpoint player is applying all the security, but my API has gotten hijacked and payload duped or encryption hacked in flight. Who owns the obligation? We actually have seen fights about this because it's happening, right? And that introduces a whole nother frontier of how do you control the security in the in-transit component. And right now, the way that is handled is a lot of people saying, well, we're using encryption. And I'm always like, and historically, how well has that worked out for everybody? Right? I mean, obviously it works great until it doesn't. But there are frontiers that are still kind of untapped in this API space. They're going to really tax the question about what security architecture, what tooling, what solutions are going to work. And back to your point, do we get stuck with the death by 1,000 cuts with 50 different service providers who are each focusing on their particular element? And then in all of that, not only do you have the complexity that causes within organizations, but then you also have the reality that it's the gaps in between all of those players.
Yes.
Bad guys exploit and capitalize on, right?
Richard, I have to say the we use encryption response gives me flashbacks to the 1990s, where as a consultant, you would ask what someone's security program was, what they were doing, and that was the first answer, right? It's we use encryption. And that was the thing. And I mean, less relevant to this conversation, but I will say a side interest of mine that I've been spending time on is post-quantum. And the extent to which we use encryption becomes a much more complex conversation is a topic for another day, but yeah, it the whole thing is an interesting rabbit hole that we should go down sometime.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think, and just like you, I've been doing a lot of diving into the quantum pools. Oddly enough, because just some recent trips, I found that the quantum encryption messaging that is most prevalent in the market it has been in Southeast Asia. And
Mm,
I thought it was so interesting. I was like, why am I seeing? It was like, I went to a conference there, and it was like, it was like RSA banners for zero trust, that everyone had on their booths. And I was like, every other booth has got quantum encryption. And I'm like, this really isn't even a thing yet. So what is it that they're providing from a service standpoint? I love being out front and on the edge of these topics. And I know that we're certainly coming up towards time here, but what I really appreciate, Sandy, again, just reiterate the fact that you get to see all of this stuff in motion and in action, all the players that are kind of bringing you their proposals, and all of the customers that are seeking advice and guidance. I think you play a really, really important role in this conversation about what will API security be and or look like, or does it have a life where it's grown up? And or is it centralization and consolidation? I mean, I think these are all unanswered questions. But when I look at it from our own state of the API security report for 2025,
mhm.
it is very, very clear that there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, not just on the technology and security solution side, but on organizational processes, ownership, lifecycle management. Um, and some of those, and I would encourage the folks that are watching, some of those findings are, I'll use the CISO term, interesting. Um, so yes, I am very scared. But my hope is that as we, do the next rounds of these in 2026, 2027, we can tangibly begin to see some metrics improvements around the market understanding and the market action around API security specifically.
So, Richard, are you saying that all of our problems can't be solved just with more technology?
I so I'm going to get myself in so much trouble with being on the startup and solution side of the equation. That was a lot of fun for me because I'm an old executive buyer, right? I
Yeah,
mean, I used to have departmental budgets that were in the 10x more than the ARR of some of the companies that I've worked for, right? And one of the things that is a truism that we cannot continue to ignore is the vast majority of organizations buy security solutions to solve an immediate point problem,
yeah,
right? And they buy that for an external audit finding, they buy it for an assessment issue or for a breach. And we all know, we've seen the research on this. In almost every case, those solutions, these massive solutions that are household names, they're 15% optimized on total capability of those tools. And I think we're starting to see the whiplash on that, where organizations are starting to recognize that if I'm only using 15% of the capacity of the actual feature functionality of a tool, maybe I should go back and reassess whether I can get that number up closer to 50 or 60%.
yeah,
And there will be, economic savings and operational efficiencies gained. I think that, we have built a pretty wild salad of security
yeah,
solutions in a lot of companies, and we haven't really put a lot of attention on optimization and performance expectations around those solutions. And some of that, frankly, I mean, that some of that's the solutions industry, but a lot of that is just company leadership, right? You have to be
yeah.
willing to go dive into those waters. So no, technology won't solve everything. In fact, I think sometimes technology, particularly in the security solution side, may be making things worse. But I'll stop talking after I said that. So
Well, let me just hit one thing before we take some questions, because you did raise in your response, I think, a point that I did want to bring home a little bit, which is my conversations with customers when they first reach out about API security. One of the things that I often find myself guiding them on is all of the existing tooling they have in their environment. that may do some element of API security that, back to your point on utilization, they are not actually taking full advantage of what they already have and may not even be aware. And it's understandable. In a lot of cases, API security might be a new feature or a new element of support to existing security solutions, and you might not be aware of it. But it, you know, before I send someone to go shopping, the first question I'll usually ask is, what do you already have and are you using it? And
Yep.
then going back to, okay, and what are your developers using? Do you already have an API gateway? You probably do.
Yep.
Is your dev team using an API management solution? Probably worth checking on that as well. Like all of these pieces, API security and APIs pervade so many other tool sets. And I don't think there's full awareness of that. And if you're going to go to this point where you get to a more consolidated approach, first understand what you already have to use.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's excellent advice.
Well, Sandy and Richard, thank you both so much for this discussion. It has been fantastic. I have been on mute and off screen, just kind of riveted to the edge of my seat as as the both of you been talking. A couple questions though, just before we go. Sandy, you kind of touched on it when you start to engage with some of these enterprises and they start to ask you some questions around their own API security program. Between the two of you, like what are a couple just very practical tips that you can give to these organizations that are just starting out on their journey? We know that this is still an evolving space and people are still learning about how do they secure APIs. What are some very practical tips that each one of you can give to the listeners who are attending this webinar today?
I can start on this. And I think it's something I've already highlighted before, Richard. It's the make sure that the dev team is involved in the conversation. If it's just security engaging me, then I want to know, bring your dev lead next time. That's where I'd start.
Yeah, absolutely. And since we've waxed philosophical and poetic for the majority of this, I'll try and keep my answer short, which is hard for me. But in this particular case, it's easy, and I take the security practitioner's side on this, which is first of all, I think that you can't protect or you don't know your risk for what you can't see is a trite comment, right? There's nobody that works in security that doesn't understand that.
Yeah.
But the reality is that we're working in a weaponized environment when we're talking about APIs, so we need to understand the entire scale and breadth and depth of the attack surface. That is a catalog and discovery and risk assessment exercise, but it is absolutely fundamental to understanding where you're going to apply your resources, how you can capitalize on current state technologies, by just simply changing traffic routing patterns, or you don't necessarily have to solve everything, with a security tool, but you have to understand what it is that you're looking at, and I think that's the very first step for any organization that's just beginning.
Do either one of you, I've and the customers I've talked with this in the past, they've talked about a crawl, walk, run approach to API security. Any comments on kind of that perspective when it comes to building your program as an organization? What's your comment back, or how do you give guidance when it comes to a crawl, walk, run approach to protecting APIs?
Well, I'll jump in on this one first. I think it's a short-sighted strategy. And the reason is your adversaries are not operating on a crawl, walk, run, right? And that might be risk adjusted based upon industry. I think if you're in banking or in telecommunications right now and your attitude is that we're going to crawl, walk, run, you're in serious trouble, right? And that may not necessarily be the same degree of trouble, faced in manufacturing or in other industrials, but the reality is that every new exploit effort that happens during a technology evolution always focuses on two sectors first. Who's moving money, banking and financial services, and who's moving data. And telecom and wireless are typically at the front end the bad things. And that's not an opinion. That's actually the news that we've seen for the last 4 or 5 years in API security and breaches.
Yeah, that tracks. I'm thinking of a lot of the breaches that I've tracked over the last several years, and you're right that a lot of them fall into those realms. It's interesting. I mean, I would go back to, even if you're thinking about strategy in a program, back to what Richard said a little while ago about having to understand what's there. I mean, good luck creating an API security program if you don't have a full view of your APIs. And I recall from previous conversations we've had, Richard, that, when you talk to your clients and you start to do discovery, you find that there are a whole mass of APIs that they don't know about. And
Yeah.
that's something that I hear over and over again. So, I come back to, you've got to get the inventory and the taxonomy and the discovery in place, or all of the other pieces that are incredibly necessary are going to be, I mean, I could call it ineffective, or I could call it chock full of holes, or I could just call it Swiss cheese, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So before we wrap today, any other, final comments for the audience with regards to, guidance, recommendations? Just want to make sure that each of you have a little bit of a, wrap up commentary for the folks that have attended the webinar today.
I can go first on this because I think that, Richard, you've pointed out a couple of times that that's interesting means I'm scared. And what I don't want people to leave this webinar being is scared of APIs and feeling like they have to put the hammer down and say you can't do API development because that's unrealistic, that minimizes your business opportunity, that's going to hurt you competitively, that's going to hurt you in terms of business opportunity, all of those things. So what I hope people take away from this is APIs are incredibly important in terms of ways of generating new business. You're not going to stop development from doing this. If you try to stop development from doing this, you're the one who's going to be out the door, not development. So your job is to figure out how to enable them to do that in a safe manner. And that's why we have to talk about that taxonomy and the governance and the discovery and the tooling and all of those pieces in order to protect them. But please don't be scared, or be smartly scared at least.
Yeah, no, I think we should reserve being scared for security people only, because that's the weight that we're expected to carry for everybody. Um,
Yeah.
and but I think that I do kind of laugh. I sometimes feel like Clint Eastwood and Grand Prix sitting on the porch going, "You kids get off my lawn." But I think to temper concerns and maybe some conditioned pessimism that I have when I have these conversations. Look, I want to emphasize the fact that this is a really exciting time in technology evolution, right? I actually think that atomization, democratization is incredibly powerful. We're going to see, I mean, separate of the whole AI conversation, we've already seen the capabilities that APIs deliver in personalized service, personalized customer experience. When used correctly, in the ability to do things like delegate control and access to things for parents and family members who might have handicap or some type of health condition. I mean, there's really cool things happening, and I love the power that we see with APIs. What I encourage folks to do as a parting thought is just remember the words of Uncle Ben to Peter Parker, right? With great responsibility comes, with great power comes great responsibility, right? We're introducing all of these powerful capabilities into the network that comes with responsibility and accountability to make sure that they're secure, to make sure we're honoring, privacy rights, all the things that have always been part of our remit and security. But we definitely need to see a lot of coming together on this between all of the different constituencies that we've talked about in order to optimize and maximize what we could actually get out of the API economy going forward.
That's fantastic. Once again, Sandy, Richard, thank you both so much for today. Want to let everybody know on on the webinar that everyone will receive a copy of the 2025 State of API Security Report. And if there are any unanswered questions, we will follow up with and reach out to you one-on-one to make sure that those questions are answered. So once again, thanks to you both, and thanks again, everyone, for tuning in.
And we're out.